Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to Climate in the Newsroom, where we'll show you how newsrooms think about climate, how they report on it, and we'll also take you through some examples. My name is Denise Ruby. I'm a climate and environment journalist and a National Geographic explorer. I spent the last year at Harvard with the Nieman Foundation researching climate journalism. And I'm really excited to introduce this fantastic panel today. We have on my left Juliet Eilperin, the climate editor at the Washington Post, then Tristan Ahtone, the editor-at-large at Grist, Hannah Fairfield, the New York Times' climate editor, and Jason Margolis, the new climate science editor at the Boston Globe. We'll be speaking for about an hour, and then for half an hour, we'll open up to the room so you can ask some questions. And then I know it said on the schedule that we'll be doing this until 12. We have a reception outside. I was told there will be some drinks. I hope that you can join us for that. I'm very excited to welcome you all here. Thank you. Journalism plays such a critical role in conveying the climate crisis. But at the same time, climate journalism is on the grander scale still something that's relatively new. And a lot of news shows are trying to figure out how to best report on it. And just to set us up, I was hoping that each of you could give us an idea of how big your teams are and the resources that are available to you. Let's start with Tristan, because Tristan, you work at Grist, which covers exclusively climate. What does that mean in terms of your resources and how big your team is?
First, thanks for having me, and thank you everybody for coming. It's an honor to be here. Grist has been around for almost 20 years covering climate. I think our tagline is we were covering climate before it was hot. I don't know if we're actually going with that now. I can't remember. But we have a team of about 30 people or so. I think the Newsroom, our organization is about 60, 75 people. So we have a fairly large team covering a lot of different beats. When it comes to climate, from doing everything from intensive data to art and imagery to just straight reporting and editing. So we have a fairly large team, fairly well resourced in terms of what we do, and put out a ton of content, basically. So that's, in a nutshell, what we do.
Hannah, what's the situation like at the Times?
I started the climate desk at the Times in 2017 with about a dozen people. That's reporters and editors, a visual editor, graphics editors, photo editors. And since then, we've grown to be almost twice that size, just above 20 right now.
And Juliet, the Post invested early on in climate coverage. You won a Pulitzer Prize for a series you did on explaining the consequences of going beyond 2 degrees. What's the situation like on your team?
Yeah, so for context, and I have a question, so hopefully I'm and also again, thank you for hosting us. So we started much smaller than these other teams. We were originally basically 5 people in terms, including at that time, of reporters and 1 editor. And then a couple of years ago, we expanded once, and then to nearly a dozen people, and now we are close to 30 people. And again, that includes, as Hannah's mentioning, like kind of a mix of reporters and editors, including visual editors. We have a dedicated graphics team within our department, and as well as a range of designers and.
Jason, what about the Globe? I know you hired a few new climate journalists, I think, within the past year, and you are quite new to the team as well.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here at Harvard. We have 3 dedicated reporters. However, we rely on some freelancers. We all share resources at the Globe. We share the graphics team, the photographers, and I'm trying to get other desks involved in the climate stories. So the business team, the weather team, the sports desk. So trying to take advantage of many of the assets within the Globe. We just don't have, we're not nearly as big as the Post or the Times. So yeah, that's our situation.
And let's stick with you for a moment, Jason, because a few years ago, the Globe did this story on Cape Cod and how it was affected by global warming. And my understanding is that this had quite an important role to play, the story, in how you. Let me see if we can actually get this to play. Whoops. Yeah, here it is. This story played quite an important role in how the newsroom changed its understanding, I think, of climate change and how you were able to expand the team. I know it was before your time, but I was hoping you could take us through this story and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I started last year at the Globe, but I've been covering climate issues and environmental issues for 20 plus years. And I asked some of the people who've been around when this came out, and it did change the culture at the Globe a bit. It's not like people woke up and realized, oh my gosh, there's this thing called climate change. But I think it was eye-opening that, oh my gosh, there's this thing called climate change, and it's already happening, and it's already impacting one of the jewels of New England. So not only did it, was it startling to people within the newsroom, the story did really well. It was nominated for a Pulitzer. It was very well received by our readers. And we hired a climate reporter, and we hired another. So it kind of got things going. I think the people who were steeped in the climate world, it was kind of like, yeah, we know this. But to a lot of people, there were beautiful visuals and graphics and video, and they did a great job. And I think a lot of people, they didn't realize that climate change was having the impact it's already happening.
Hannah, you were a senior visual editor before, and you became the climate editor in 2017, as you mentioned. I know you've done a lot to really try to shape the team over the years. Can you take us through that process and how it's changed since you joined?
Sure. So in 2017, the Climate Desk had grown out of a working group within the New York Times that had representatives from each of the big news desks that were focused on climate. So at that time, I was the representative from the graphics desk. And it was really clear that there was climate coverage happening at all corners of the Times, and the executive editor at the time, Dean Baquet, really wanted to bring that together and create a team that was very specifically focused on covering climate. So I put my hand up for that job and was lucky enough to get it. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to take that on is because I saw so many really, really rich visual opportunities with climate data. So being able to sort of take climate data and show trends and kind of lift the veil on a lot of what was happening in the world that we could see. So that was kind of the origin of the desk. And I made sure that we really built it around a lot of good visual resources. And one of the very first things that we did was I asked a graphics editor named Nadia Popovich, who I think has been to Harvard here and spoken to a group of people. I asked her to take a look at polling data, and this is what she turned up. And this was one of the very first graphics that we published, and it looks at how Americans think about climate change. And you can see on the orange map that most of Americans feel that global warming are going to harm people in the United States. Now, again, this is 2017. This is a while ago, right? But when you contrast that with the question, do you think it's going to harm you? Most Americans said, no, I don't think it's going to harm me. And in this set of maps, I realized very quickly that we had a really important job to do to be able to help people understand that it is, in fact, hurting and harming the world that we're living in right now. It's not something that's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. It's right here. So this is a very good kind of origin story. And from there, I thought, all right, well then how do we as journalists help people understand that it's happening around them? The Cape Cod story was an amazing piece of journalism. And it really, that in terms of just helping people locally see what was really happening. So I thought, all right, well, the Times is a little bit more of a national paper, and we don't have our own Cape Cod. So how am I really going to think about this? And I started thinking about the opportunities that we have for personalization and how we can harness personalized data, asking people where they're from, geolocating them, and showing them what is happening in their own backyard. And from that came out a project that I, in shorthand, called Hotter Hometowns. So we built an interactive that asks you the year you were born and where your hometown was. And we kick back to you a chart that will show you how many very hot days, days above 90 degrees, there were the year you were born, and then how many hot days there will be in your hometown when you're 80. And I think that kind of personalization helps people immediately understand this is changing to my own place. And so we published that a few years ago, and I've really been trying to lean into a lot of personalization where we can to really emphasize how much our world is changing right now.
Thank you. Juliet, you've been a reporter for most of your career, but the climate editor for 3 now.
Yeah.
How have things changed at the Post?
Things have changed dramatically when for context, I started my career as a politics reporter. I covered Congress. That's what I did for the first several years of my career. And I got really tired and burnt out covering Congress, as one might imagine. Read a book about how it was dysfunctional. Hasn't really changed since then. And so at one point, it's very funny because some people have very calculated moves in their careers. I am the opposite of that. And I went to the top editors on the national desk and said, look, I really cannot do this anymore. Like, what else is open? Like on our staff, just show me the open slots. And it happened that the person who was the national environmental reporter was just about to switch jobs. And so I took this job, which was widely seen as a demotion within my newsroom. People came up when I was at the water cooler and shared their condolences and things like that. And it was funny because in those initial years, there was a tremendous amount of freedom because it was not a top tier priority for the Post. And so I really kind of navigated my own way with the help of at that time, particularly our editor, who actually had been at the Boston Globe at one point as well. And it was, and one of the funniest conversations I remember, again, at that very beginning, is Mike Grunwald, who's a friend and a wonderful journalist who had been at the Post, is no longer doing that and is writing books and writes for Canary Media. We sat down and he said to me, I want you to know, I think there's this big story and it's global warming and you really need to focus on it. And again, I'm a perfectly smart person and this was sort of news to me. It was not something that I had focused on, including someone who was covering basically every national issue of importance that was being debated by the House and Senate. And so essentially I started, looking at it as at that point, very contested terrain when George W. Bush was president, and found lots of great stories to write in that context. I wrote a lot about oceans and that had not been as covered, and to some extent, of course, the intersections. And then over time, it just became a really important topic. And what we found is that, I switched at one point. I went back to covering the White House, and while I covered Barack Obama's second term, and in the first term, I was still covering the environment and climate, and it really wasn't something that was a priority for the president. But then by the second term, it did. And so there was really this intersection. And one of the things I would say, and this is, I think, a testament to, of course, the work that, the Times and Grist and others have done, that as our competitors were producing increasingly powerful and sophisticated work, it also made it, more of a priority within the Washington Post newsroom. And then, of course, a group of us did work on this 2C Beyond the Limit project under Trish Wilson, the editor at the time. The fact that we won the Pulitzer really gave the kind of recognition that we needed to argue for greater resources and greater priority.
Tristan, you've been at Grist, I think, for 3 years. How is that different for you at a place that already just focuses on climate, where you don't have to argue for every single story to get resources, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think my journey into Grist has been a little bit different in terms. I cover, I edit our Indigenous Affairs desk, so all of our content and stories are Indigenous stories for Indigenous audiences. So I think one of the things that's become interesting about working at Grist is actually sort of arguing for resources to be put into more Indigenous affairs coverage. I'm of the opinion that news organizations should, especially around climate, need to be incorporating more essentially marginalized voices here. So we're talking about Indigenous peoples. We're talking about climate refugees. We're talking about, climate activists, not just like Greta Thunberg, but folks like Manuel Turan, who was killed protesting Cop City in Georgia, and looking at the police infrastructure around monitoring activists in the climate space. And I also think that we need to be having a lot more coverage of our non-human and more than human relatives that are threatened by climate change and going extinct at alarming rates. Our coverage is not usually focused on these areas. We're not grounding in those specific viewpoints from those groups that are most impacted. So on my end, we're looking at Indigenous affairs, and we're really thinking about how do we make climate actually an Indigenous affairs beat. The big issue with covering climate and Indigenous affairs is that every story is a climate story, and I think we all know this in all of our beats, is that every story is a climate story. But the big issue here is that what we're running into is sort of a lack of understanding, I would say, in terms of just how deep that actually goes about how a language story is actually a climate story. Being able to make those leaps and being able to sort of like talk, like when we're talking to our sources, we're always sort of hearing, especially from Indigenous sources, that well, yeah, it's kind of a climate story. Like the problem is the sort of siloing, I would say. And so in terms of like resourcing, it's really thinking about how we're getting more resources into expanding how we're thinking about climate, and especially in an Indigenous affairs setting. And most especially because we think very differently about how our stories work, is that our audiences are Indigenous audiences. So that means that we're not trying to do sort of like things that a community already knows about. I think everybody probably remembers like 10 years ago, it's like this thing is happening in this community. Nobody's talking about it. Like those headlines that used to be like really popular. Yeah, no, somebody is talking about it. It's that community. You're just you're like Columbusing the story, and you're taking it, you're like, you're taking it to another audience. We don't ever want to be doing that. So trying to think about audience, trying to think about how we're getting into these topics and trying to broaden how we're doing this, I think is actually the big challenge that we're running into these days in terms of our climate coverage.
And I think this story would be a great example of what you were just talking about. It was called Misplaced Trust, and it was about a university student, a member of an Indigenous community, and how she was struggling to pay for university. Maybe you could take us through that story, how you learned about it, how you decided to cover it, and why it is a climate story. Because it's not, when you start reading it, immediately apparent, I think.
Yeah, so this story, Misplaced Trust, is about land-grant universities. Some of y'all may be familiar with work that's been done in the past about the history of land-grant universities and where they got their land. So no surprise, it was land that was expropriated from Indigenous peoples at the founding of the U.S. So what this work does is build on that sort of like background and history by looking at something called state trust lands, which sounds really boring, and it is, because state trust lands are just like nobody cares about the stuff. But what you're looking at here are sort of images of state trust land. So basically at statehood, states would have to sign enabling acts, which became like graduated from territories into states. And as part of those sort of like acts, the federal government gave them gifts of free land. These were sort of like dowries for entering the union. Essentially, sort of like land grant universities are like the original sort of Nepo babies of like the US. And that land is still held by those universities, which helps fund them. So what we wanted to do was locate that land and look at how it was being used. So we found 14 universities, 8.2 million acres that they used to offset their budgets, taken from 123 nations. In 2022, it was $2.2 billion that they pulled in revenue from these lands. 25% of it was fossil fuel extraction. The rest was timber and mining, some agriculture. And we have Native students at these universities that can't afford to go to school there, even though we've been able to prove that it is their land that's being used. In fact, our ongoing investigation is looking into how many states actually have lands inside reservation boundaries that are being used to offset budgets for state institutions like K through 12 schools, colleges, fisheries, prisons, you name it. There's all these sort of like institutions that rely on lands inside reservations to offset taxes. Right. So this on its surface may not look like a climate story, but obviously it has a huge climate impact in terms of like fossil fuel extraction on these lands. More or less, what kind of a future is being set up by these institutions to offset costs now, when in the future it's something that we're going to continue to have to pay for in some pretty horrific ways. So I think that's kind of a nutshell of this story and some of our ongoing work around this.
And I think that also brings us to the question of objectivity, which is this notion in journalism that there's one way to report a story and that, we don't take sides, everything's always perfectly balanced. And that's something that's been challenged quite a bit, especially by, I think, younger journalists over the past years. Jason, how do you feel about that? I often hear, you're a climate journalist, how does that make you different from a climate activist, I guess?
Right. Well, I think the debate is climate change real is done in the media. Certainly, I mentioned I did my first climate stories about 22 years ago, and that was very much part of the equation, but that's not debated anymore in the mainstream media. Look, I don't think if you report what scientists are saying and what is actually happening, that makes you an expert. My job is to look out the window and if it's raining, tell you it's raining. That's not taking sides. It's just raining. If the sea levels are rising, that doesn't make me an advocate. The sea levels are rising. It's measurable. So I think it's changed a lot, and I don't know when exactly that tipping point was. I want to say, curious what you guys think. I think when Trump came into office, people said, all right, this is enough. Like, the media started just saying, like, these things aren't true. We don't need to report on it. I think it changed a lot in a lot of topics, but certainly on climate issues, that we just didn't give any credence to people saying, wait a second, all the science is not in. No, the science is in. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. Hannah, what do you think?
I think the advent of attribution science had a lot to do with it. The modeling and the science is being able to actually look at a heat wave and say, hey, if you take, many decades of global warming out of the equation, you're not going to get this kind of heat wave. To be able to publish those kind of rapid attribution studies so quickly after news events, I think changed the game in many, many ways. And so I think, and it's not just attribution science, it's all kinds of different modeling. The science is getting stronger and better, and the research that people are doing is getting clearer. And frankly, I think we're doing a little bit of a better job, as these teams have grown, being able to communicate that to readers. So I think leaning on the science, right? I mean, the mission of the Times is to help people understand the world around them. And that is our job. And I feel very strongly that is not telling people what they should do. It's telling people and showing people what is happening and opening lots of doors to information to be able to communicate really clearly what we see, what we observe, what scientists see and observe, and what connections that they're making, but not what people should do.
Juliet, one of the post's former editors-in-chief, Eilperin, described objectivity as a process. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? How do you think about it in terms of your climate coverage?
Well, I think what it means is that you're, and I'll quote another former executive editor of the Post, Sally Busby, who talked about the importance of being fair. And I think that's it's a different question. It means that do you go to significant lengths to accurately reflect the perspective of different sides on an issue, even as you're absolutely hewing to the science. And like a great example I would give is actually a story that we published this morning that I was helping edit yesterday in between panels, which was on the push that's underway right now within different scientific agencies in the federal government to ensure that essentially science will be able to continue on climate, on weather, without interference should you have a change in administration. So this is, and the reason this issue first actually caught my attention is a reporter had shared that an EPA union representing half of the employees in their most recent contract, this was last month, had struck a deal where they have a provision where they would not be penalized or punished for essentially the scientific research they did or things that they commented on. And I thought that was really interesting as someone who was on the front lines as a reporter covering under the last administration, that this was interesting because it kind of shows, okay, look, these people are essentially girding for battle. Should there be a second Trump administration? And so they're taking these steps. But an absolutely important part of that equation is what is the former president and his allies, what are they saying about what they want to do on these issues? And because there's something called Project 2025, which is an initiative of several conservative think tanks, you can see they've already laid out, this is what they want to do to the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You can quote from those reports and seek to interview the people who worked on those issues. And then you can juxtapose that with obviously what people at those agencies think. And to me, then again, as and I'm saying, then we're doing our job. We're giving people the full landscape of what's happening, grounding it in the science. And that and that's the way that you really achieve, the outcome that you would want.
And since we're already talking about science, could we briefly talk about this story you did and how you went about it, how it was reported?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about it, yeah.
So this story was part of a series that we did last year, Unearthing, kind of looking at how we're looking to really the prehistoric record to understand what's in store in terms of climate change. And this was a collaboration between Sarah Kaplan, Simone de Croquet, Frank Hulley-Jones, and Emily Wright. And again, it shows you this integration of what we're talking about. That's a text writer, a graphics journalist, and two designers. And Bonnie Jo Mount, a fantastic photographer. And together, Sarah and Bonnie Jo traveled to the Greenland ice sheet, where there was an expedition where there are plenty of ice cores that have been extracted from the ice sheet, but no one had ever been able to extract bedrock to basically see when was the last time that the world had been warm enough that there was no ice on the Greenland ice sheet. And so they journeyed and braved really terrible temperatures and multiple hardships in order to get there. And one thing that's very interesting is they got to this, Jörg Schaefer is the lead scientist who you're seeing right there. And what's fascinating is that they got there at the moment of the brink of disaster. What had happened is that essentially there had been a crack in the ice that had halted the drill's progress, so it wasn't going to get to the bedrock, and there was a real question of failure of this entire mission. And so they chronicled what happened. Again, Bonnie Jo took these videos in addition to the great photography. And by integrating it, and if you scroll down like a little more, if you don't mind, I would love to get to where Simone's graphic is of the drill. So what's really incredible, and if you keep going, is that we were able in this way to give a sense of the complexity of what this kind of science, what it took to do this science, what they hope to discover. And it's just the way that I think we are all trying to do our journalism, to really, take people on the scientific journey to help them understand what has happened millions of years ago and what, could happen in the future. And so that's the kind of.
I'm wondering how this story performed, quote unquote,
Yeah.
right? Because that's something we talk about so much in journalism. We can see how many people read our stories. We can see how far they scroll down. And there's this so much conversation about news fatigue and also around climate change. I looked up some numbers. Pew Research Center found that in 2022, only 38% of Americans said that they followed the news closely. And that's already a drop of 13% compared to just 6 years earlier. So it's quite alarming if you work in journalism. Tell us how this story.
I mean, this story did incredibly well. It was, I believe, either the most read or one of the most read stories on our site for the entire day after it published. I believe and I'm almost positive that we republished it. We brought it back right around at the end of December. We brought back stories that we had published earlier in the year, and I'm pretty sure. And it also resonated. And we got tremendous positive feedback. One of the things which all of us are familiar with when you publish climate stories is lots of times they're really disturbing comments and a lot of, again, it has become contested terrain. And this is one where people actually were largely positive because they felt like it was this thrilling adventure. They were along for the ride and they actually learned something about science that they didn't before. So in that case, it's incredibly encouraging. Granted, like the amount of resources that had to be devoted to do a story like this and to do this series were tremendous. And you can't do that on a daily basis and support the newspaper. So obviously we put a lot of effort into some of these stories at the same time that we're trying to do other ones that aren't as time consuming.
Yeah. Tristan, do you see climate fatigue at Grist?
I mean, I have news fatigue all the time. I think we put out too many stories, honestly. I just don't know anybody who consumes news like reporters do, and I think we actually really underestimate or overestimate audiences in terms of how much what is sustainable is like quality, but just story after story after story, trying to feed sort of like the beast. It I don't think really works. I'd be curious about what other folks think here too. But I just don't know anybody in my life who's reading more than maybe 2 or 3 stories on their apps a day, kind of a thing. I just don't know people who are doing that, except other reporters. So I think, I have news fatigue all the time. I just read the headlines most of the time these days. So sometimes I see stuff and I want to read more. But my morning news feed is I'm going through my Reuters and looking at what are the headlines. Okay, cool, got it. I know what's going on. I need some more information on this, or I might need to be reporting on this later, or getting a reporter to this. But I don't know. But I'm tired all the time about just everything. So, I don't know. It's hard to separate the two.
I was speaking to a friend of mine last week, and she mentioned how she really appreciates, she's actually in the audience, how she really appreciates Grist's website because it feels so light and playful. Is that maybe a way to deal with it? Climate is so doom and gloom, but then you have a lighter...
I don't know. It could be. I mean... I don't know. Our website it's like celery green. I guess it's kind of soothing, I suppose. But I don't know. I think especially after COVID lockdowns and stuff, there's only so much time we really want to be spending on websites. I think even these large projects, which are really super impressive, and they take so much work and so much effort, and it's so much to be proud of. I mean, it really. I do feel pretty strongly that it is a very niche audience that's going to sit a 5,000 word story on a computer, right? I mean, this is one of the things that I loved about working in magazines is that when you have a magazine, you spend time with it, right? It is that physical media that you want to sit down on your couch or whatever, and you want to actually read through and have that experience. It's much harder to do this on a screen. It's just so much fatigue in terms of being able to do that. So it is a very, very difficult balance of being able to try to find ways to sort of reach audiences quickly, get all of those wonderful storytelling elements to them in an efficient manner, and also keep their attention. I mean, it's nowadays you really have to know story well to really keep somebody at your site. I just political analysis and such. I mean, I can only handle 1,000 words of that, really. I need story. We're all geared for that. And I think that's something that we're always thinking about.
How about this story you did? It's basically a story in a comic. How did you conceive that? Why did you decide to do it in a super innovative way?
Yeah, I mean, we've been covering this essentially what's called fortress conservation, where over the last few years, especially under the 30 by 30, saving 30% of the planet. We've been seeing this increasing trend of essentially roping off biodiverse areas and excluding indigenous peoples from those areas have been living there. In many parts of the world, it's been incredibly violent, and it's a fairly old sort of conservation way of doing things. So what we were really interested in doing was talking about what is the history of fortress conservation? Where does this idea of conservation come from? Like, how can we do this? And again, sort of like not bore our audiences with like a history lesson. And one of the things we arrived at was working with a comic artist to be able to say, look, we can explain a lot more of this a lot more quickly and a lot more interestingly if we just sort of like find ways to go about doing it that might engage people better. I'm a huge fan of like graphic novels and comics anyway. A lot more quickly. So this could be a 5,000 word story in which you need to we have all of our experts and we have all of the stuff and we have, or we can do this in essentially, I think this is probably about 1,000 words that we were able to sort of get across the whole history of fortress conservation in comic book form. So we really like doing that. We want to try to find ways to meet audiences where they are. You can do a lot online, but just at this point, it's just try anything. I'm big into sort of experimenting, collaborating, etc. Like, let's see if it works. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Sometimes you bake a bad cake. It's fine. Sometimes it works really well. You want to do it again. So.
Jason, the Globe is known, I think, for having, or has a reputation, or maybe its readers have a reputation for being quite loyal news readers and very supportive of the work that you do. Tell us a bit about how news fatigue, climate fatigue is affecting you, how you're trying to deal with it, and maybe this is an example you could talk about because it's like such a super local story that really shows readers, your readers specifically, how they're going to be affected.
Right. As to news fatigue, I mean, as a editor, former reporter, I don't think I have it, believe it or not. And I've also taught some undergrads in journalism, and the analogy I always use is think of what we're doing as like we're trying to cut down a tree. Our goal is to cut down a tree. And with any story, it doesn't have to be a climate story. It could be about politics. It could be about anything. And we all want our stories to change the world, but the reality is 99.99% of our stories don't change the world. But collectively, we can make a difference. So cutting down the tree. A small publication comes and they do a story on climate change and it's a little hack in the tree. And then the New York Times comes along and it's a bigger hack. And collectively, we're all, Grist comes along, Washington Post, Boston Post, we're all hacking at the tree. And eventually through story after story after story, eventually the tree will fall, and that represents change. So that's what I tell myself to keep myself going. It's like, I don't think any one story we do is going to change the world. Maybe I did when I was younger, but age makes you cynical. But that's the analogy I use. So for this story, this is about where sea level rise is at. And I hired a reporter, Erin Douglas. She came from Texas. The issues in Texas are obviously much different than what we're dealing with here in New England. So there was two reasons to do this. One is to kind of get Erin up to speed on the issues we're dealing with in New England. And we also realized a lot of really smart, informed people just didn't know the very basics of what was already happening. So this story just lays it out. If you look at 1921 as the base level, sea levels have risen 12 inches in the Boston area. So that's what we're already dealing with. And by 2030, I forget the exact number, but I think it gets tricky because you're comparing to 1921. But by 2030, I believe it could rise another 10 inches compared to levels in the year 2000 because the rate of sea level rise has accelerated in the last few years. So it just lays it out. It's explanatory journalism. And we wanted to do it so people could understand, again, as I mentioned, the Cape Coast, we're like, this is already happening. And when I started my career, we would talk about these far off years, like, oh, this could be happening in 20. I remember thinking, if I'm lucky enough to make it to 80 years, like then I'll start to see the impacts of climate change. But like, time goes fast, and I can't believe like 2030 is right around the corner, and like, we're dealing with some serious shit. We got to deal with it. And so, Boston has a plan, but not concrete steps. So they know what they want to do, but they don't know exactly how to do it or how to pay for it. And I don't think that's unique. I think cities across the world are dealing with that. I think Boston, the leaders in Boston, Massachusetts, to their credit, they have thought about it, but now they have to decide, they have to do all the engineering and all the environmental impact work. And then they have to find the money to pay for it all. And that means, building barriers and more natural restorations, places where the water can go. So again, this story just kind of lays it out, and hopefully opened a few eyes that climate change is here.
And just very briefly to give us an appreciation of like, how long does it take one reporter, I guess, to work on this story?
It depends on the reporter. I mean, people always say, when I was a reporter, say, when's my deadline? How long can I have? So deadlines are important because it focuses people, but I think this one probably took maybe a week. The graphics take a little longer, only because we have a small graphics team and we're all fighting for their attention. So, if I said to the graphics person, I need you to do this today, they could do it. But they said, oh, I got to do this story for sports and this story for business, and can I do it next Tuesday? So, that's the reality. But you could report this in a week, report it, edit, get it out.
Hannah, how about news or climate fatigue at the Times? Are there any stories that you have consistently seen perform maybe so badly that you're like, oh my God, we gotta stay away from it? And how do you try to address it?
The way I feel about news fatigue in general is that it can sometimes make our jobs a little bit harder, but it also pushes us toward telling surprising stories in surprising ways. And if we can just keep our eye on that ball, then I really think that that we can enact change and get attention. And the other thing that I see just in the New York Times newsroom is that although people talk about news fatigue, the Times' readership and the readership of a lot of journalism has really grown a lot. It used to be, I feel like, that I would look at a story and I can usually tell how many people are reading that story. And I'd be, excited if there were, a few hundred people reading that story. And now a big story will have thousands and thousands of people reading it at the very same time. So that's not a cumulative number. That's like right in that exact moment. And that's changed. And that means more people are reading journalism. And I think that's maybe why they're tired, is because more people are reading more. But I don't think they're reading less, and they're not walking away from information. So surprising stories told in surprising ways is sort of where I keep my focus. Juliet's team and Juliet edited a piece that came out yesterday that was on flooding in North Carolina, and they used a really interesting novel way of time-lapse photography to show the flooding. And I love that. It was so unique. It was so interesting. It was mesmerizing in many ways. It was a surprising way to tell a story that maybe some people are familiar with, sunny day flooding. But to be able to see that in just a really fascinating and completely new way, I feel like that's the direction that we need to run. And I think that's what keeps me focused. That was what keeps my team really focused. And nobody wants to write and read the same stories, and it can be a really interesting challenge to really push ourselves to talk to all of you, talk to researchers, talk to policymakers, and think about what's next. how can we peer around the corner? How can we figure out where the big climate story is going next? And that's a big challenge and a really exciting one for us.
Juliet, since
Yeah,
this was already brought up,
exactly.
I think this is the right one, yeah?
Yes, totally. No.
Yeah, tell us how you went about it. Like, how did you come up with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, we're doing the series called The Drowning South, and it's looking at how sea level rise is driving flooding across the Gulf Coast and the Southeast. And so we've had, a few different stories. Chris Mooney came up with the idea for the series. He was also, the originator of our 2C series. And this piece, which is just a fabulous piece, which was a collaboration between Dennis, Nico Comenda, and Emily Wright, as well as Ray Whitehouse, who's a freelancer who did who put up the cameras for us, is we really basically looked and tried to say, where's there going to be a high tide in a coastal town where we can try to document how flooding happens and how basically these drains are overtopped. And, again, it sounds like in some ways like the most boring thing to capture, right? And I think that this is, the point that it is true. Like we are constantly trying to figure out what is a new thing that we can do that, others have not done. And so that is what we, try to do in this piece, to really have you understand what is in some ways an infrastructure problem, but see it in real time in a way that really lets you understand, what is happening, what is this connection between a aspect of the changing climate, sea level rise, and something, again, this was, I can say, and I'd say we were all amazed. It posted at 5 a.m. It was the -- story on the Washington Post, site for the entire day, including, I believe, first thing this morning. People were really intrigued by it. And I find this interesting, and I don't know, we ourselves were a little surprised. I don't know if it's because people can also relate to flooding, and that's something, and, somehow that's more compelling than extreme heat or some of the other climate impacts. I'm not sure. But I do think, especially, that what we were really trying to get with this is how can you visualize this in a way? And I do think visual storytelling is one of the most important things that we do.
Hannah, you brought up telling surprising stories in surprising ways, but there's so many stories of all your publications that I know take sometimes months to do, in it's often such a big team effort. This, I think you said, was done by one person? Is that
one
right?
person. Yep. One person. So sometimes it feels like, big news organizations have, lots of people that they can throw on really big projects. And we do, absolutely. But sometimes you can do projects relatively quickly with a really interesting data set, and one person really getting immersed in this. So one of the reasons that I love this project so much, there are a couple of reasons, but one of them is that it's really playing with form. So this is actually pretty simple. This is state data on where that state makes its electricity, and how that has changed over time. And you can see, so Iowa wind, look at that advent of wind. That's just absolutely incredible. I will note that this data ends in 2019, but very soon we're going to update this chart, and I'm really excited to see how different states will change. So that's Iowa, just completely fascinating. And you can keep going. So you've got natural gas, Nevada, and then that's, if you scroll down just a little bit more, then you can explore your own state, and we would sort of run through and do a summary of every single state. So again, back to the kind of personalization thing that I was mentioning before, people can find their own states. We did the scroller at the top to help people understand what exactly we're doing here. This is a format of a chart called a bump chart. And the reason it's called a bump chart is because it's done by a percentage. So you're just looking at 100% of something. But the topmost data point is always the thing that is the most, the majority. And so you get these sort of funny patterns because if something flips from being 42% in 1 year to 51% in 1 year, it's going to flip to the top of the chart. It's going to bump everything else out of the way. So I get a kick out of showing different kinds of ways to present information and kind of teaching our readers how to understand this kind of visualization, but telling the story along the way. And I think that's, again, kind of surprising stories in kind of surprising ways. This has a personalization aspect. And every state is really, really different. And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what keeps our lights on, right? But that is kind of power is at the essence of the climate story, and how do we power the world in which we live? And so this helps to lift the veil on your state and where you get your electricity and how that has changed over time. Now, it's not something that people have a lot of control over, but it's something that the more you understand about your world and about where your electricity comes from, the more you can begin to sort of look around and see where changes can actually be enacted. So I'm excited about seeing the new data. I think it's going to be able to go up through 2023. And you guys can look forward to that in the coming weeks at the Times.
And one thing, just riffing off that, I mean, as you're saying, personalization is so important. It's something that Monica Umanu, who's our visual storytelling and is the, stories, including the flooding story, it really empowers our audience. And so, for example, when you look at something like this, then if you're deciding whether or not to have an electric vehicle, you can see, how much better it actually would be, because if you live in a state that's still primarily burning coal for electricity, that does change the equation compared to one that's having, renewables. And so I think that's really important, and that's something that, again, it's like we're letting you know what the equation's like, and then you can make your own decisions based on it.
And that's already sort of the question about politics and policy, and we are in a major election year, not just in the US, but across the world. And it's so sometimes startling to me how much people, when you talk to them, say they care about climate, but when we look at elections and how much it plays a role, it's still not really a decisive issue. It's never really been. My question is that where do you think that disconnect comes from? Since you have reporters out in the field all the time, and is it something that climate journalists should even think about addressing? Tristan, maybe we can start with you.
I mean, I haven't covered elections or politics for a very long time, so I can't say whether or not this is something that we need to be thinking about. But what I would say in terms of the things that I think that reporters need to be thinking about, especially in light of elections and people making decisions, is really, I think, interrogating the larger ideas that are sort of like that we're looking at. So, for instance, a good example is like sustainability, right? Like, I think everybody in the room here is probably really into the idea of sustainability. Like, we need a sustainable economy. We need sustainable, like, green energy. We need to be sustainable so that that we can get climate change under control. Well, I think what we find, at least on the Indigenous Affairs desk here, is that really raises some really big questions about exactly what we're trying to sustain here. Is capitalism, right? We're trying to find ways in which we can keep this system operating in a way that we won't have to change anything, right? Like, we are not needing to think of, like, when people are imagining the future here, it's all green, it's all like e-vehicles out here, right? Like, everything's fine. Like, we've got everything under control now. We're back to normal, sort of a thing, right? And I think one of the things that we are always trying to think about are what are the things that make climate change impacts like as vicious as they are. When we think about climate change, we're thinking about sort of like it's the top of a table, and like there are all these different legs to it, right? So we've got like colonialism as like a major leg that keeps climate change in place. We're thinking of racism, ableism, capitalism. We're thinking about all of these isms that keep it in place. And if we solve climate change tomorrow, all of these things are still here. And it just means that something else is going to replace it. And I think that as climate reporters, it's our duty to start thinking about these larger ideas and these larger policy ideas that are being pushed here and exactly what that means. Again, sustainability means like more mining for transition minerals. Those are coming from indigenous lands. Those are coming from my homelands. They are impacting my family. They are impacting my community, right? for a very small percentage of the planet here. So I think that it's our duty to think about that, and that will hopefully influence how people are voting and thinking about going to the polls in the future when we're having more critical discussions about what climate looks like, what its factors are, and what the solutions that are being proposed are.
I'd like to get the rest of the panel
to weigh in on that as well, and then we'll open it up to the room for questions.
Could you give me a pinpointed specific what you want to know what I think? Sorry.
Should,
I was listening to Tristan.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I mean, what do you think about this disconnect that we apparently see between people saying that they care about climate, but then it's not a decisive issue in politics? And is that something that climate journalists should try to address in any way, or should we just continue reporting the news as it is?
I mean, it's hard. I was reading a story in the Times, I think yesterday. It was a op-ed from the governor of Nevada why Trump is so popular there, and it just comes down to inflation. And this is not a comment on Biden versus Trump, but it's kind of a depressing commentary about human nature that people are only voting because their gallon of gas costs a dime more, and they think somehow Biden is responsible for it. So, I think we put out the news, and what else? We can't change human nature. And I'm not saying I am a better human than them. Like you care about your own world, your own surroundings. That's natural. You care about your kids, your community, and it's climate change is a really hard one. Like it's hard to get people to care about flooding halfway around the world or what could happen in 10 years, but you don't stop. And the word sustainability has been thrown around a lot. I think, giving people hope and options is good. We did a story, I said we've done a lot of explanatory pieces. We did a story on just like, what can you do to make your home more energy efficient? But we couched it as like, not only are you making it energy efficient, which is better for the climate, but guess what? You can save a ton of money. And, I think what was interesting, I think people clicked on it probably because like, oh, I can lower my bills because there's all this money I can get from that's available for free for me to make these changes, put in heat pumps or solar panels, that the government's going to pay me to do these things and I'll save money. I don't like to read the reader comments, but I did on this one, and it was kind of depressing though. People were like, oh, must be nice to, for these lefty liberals to have all this money for solar panels. Like, well, if you read the story, you're saving money. And so, it's just human beings are tricky.
What's your take, Hannah?
I think one of the things that news can do in this space is really help to dispel fear. I think it's just and by dispelling fear, I mean building information and sharing information. One of the things that in the political arena I've been thinking about is looking at the trajectories of things like EV adoption and transformation of our power grid nationally. What can be influenced politically? What can be sped up and what can be slowed down? And being able to share that information with readers to be able to say, look, the adoption of EVs, it can be potentially slowed down, but probably not reversed. There are market forces here. There are consumer choices that are all pointing in certain directions. So I think fear is such it's prevalent, and I think in the political sphere, it really can be a kind of motivator. And I feel like a really good goal can be to help to present information that can reduce fear and increase information around, local versus state versus federal, what can be done in those different spheres, and how much of different things are actually consumer driven. If we can sort of move in that direction, the idea that climate is not number one in on the forefront of every single voter, doesn't worry me particularly. There are a lot of really important issues, and everybody votes the way that they rank them individually. But the more that we can reduce the amount of fear about the future, I think that's good space for us to be in.
Can I just have one thing? I will say, I remember like the Pew Research Center does a poll of the 21 most important issues. And like in 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010, climate or environment was always dead last. And we're no longer dead last. So, I mean, we're still at the bottom, but, people care about other things less. So we're making progress.
It's a very upbeat note. Juliet.
Yeah. I mean, I covered elections for years, and there's only one election, which was the re-election of Congressman Richard Pombo in California, where he lost he had chaired the Resources Committee in the House, and that's the only time I've ever covered an election where the environment was a decisive factor. And what happens is people care, it matters to people, but it's a question of voter intensity. Like, that's just not there. And again, I just think it is absolutely not our job to, tell voters where they need to rank things. I think that if you, produce the most compelling stories possible and people can connect them to their lives, then they can make their own decisions. And it could very well shift at some point. But we've also had tons of climate disasters, for example, and that has not had like a super significant impact on the electorate. So it's hard to tell.
Great, thank you so much. Let's take some questions.
I see this person in the podium was first. Yeah.
Do I need a mic or?
Oh, sure. Oh, great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Greg Beyer, and I work at the intersection of sustainability data and artificial intelligence. And the key thing that when I come to events here at Harvard and I hear about the latest climate journalism, I'm always gutted by all the stories that I've missed. And so I really feel like you guys do such great work. And I wonder if there's a way for you to surface that or create gates for people to stay connected to the thread of work that you're doing and to sort of somehow stay engaged with like the really, really terrific. You're doing such great work. If I go to your site, I don't have any way of finding it.
You should subscribe to.
Subscribe.
There you go.
Well, I think a lot of newspapers do have, like we have a climate subsection. It's hard to navigate to, but I would love it to be like climate up at the top, but you gotta go down like metro, sports, business. It's there. It's just hard to find.
It's easy to find. I can find the section, obviously,
Yeah.
and I go to it right away. But when these stories come and go, it's hard to find it again. And using the search function, unlike the New York Times or the Financial Times, it's terrible.
Agreed. Our site search function is not nearly as good as Google. One of the products that has really come out of a lot of newsrooms in the past couple of years that I think was designed to address this is newsletters, because a lot of newsrooms now provide newsletters as here's what I think is important and catch you up on all of the things that we publish. And that's sort of across the newsroom. So ours is Climate Forward. It comes out twice a week. If you don't have time to check the website every single day, it's a nice compendium. And the Post has great ones, and other folks do too. And it's not just Times newsletters. We also do a roundup of what we feel like is the most curated, best of other, of Grist and of the Post and of the Globe as well. And and it's not, I'm not just plugging the Times newsletter. There's a lot of really good newsletters out there, and that might be the thing that helps in this space. Or maybe there's a new product that we haven't thought of yet, but it's a problem. Agreed. I think everybody would agree.
We'll try to get to everyone. The lady with the black jacket.
Thank you. Just quickly in answer to your question, Climate Nexus used to be the best newsletter, and they had their MacArthur Foundation support just pulled, so they have folded. But they had a roundup of everything. So I feel like that's a huge absence that's been left in the market, a huge space. But just quickly, I'm Eleanor Powers. I have spent the majority of my career doing cohort studies of publishing for organizations like the OPA, DCN. But I've also worked with small publishers with Lenfest and the Knight Foundation. And the thing that strikes me is that there's a role that you play in breaking ground with people who are interested and are heat seekers and are going to read about this. But there's a huge gap of explaining the climate crisis, and maybe in other language, to people who live in counties of less than 100,000 people, who are the people who, if you read the Yale studies, believe that climate change might be real, but don't believe that it is human caused, and won't support policies for it. How do we change that? Because those are the red-leaning counties by far across the board in the United States. And it's not just a question of voting, it's a question of also supporting local policy. How do we support that change? Because that's where a lot of the gridlock happens in the United States.
I'll do just a first stab at it. We go there. We go there. We travel there. We talk to people. We write stories from those areas, and we make sure that they're a part of the story. And I think that that's something that that organizations with a little bit more of a national focus have the inability to do. And I think within the past decade, have definitely worked toward that. Is there a lot more to be done in that space? Absolutely. But that's a real solution to what you're describing.
The person in the striped shirt had a question.
So I'm on the science side of this. Two things. It's very difficult to know what is not involved in climate. Nobody mentioned that. Can you think of any aspect of human society, biology, geology, any science that is not involved? But my real question is, why didn't anybody even mention, as far as I can tell, human population growth as the real driver of climate change? Years ago, we were told that human population was going to stabilize at 7 billion people. Now we're being told it's maybe going to stabilize at 10 or 11 billion people. Isn't this the real driver of the climate problem? If human population had stabilized at 2 billion, we could deal with it. The New York Times write about the falling birth rate in Japan, as though it's a terrible thing. But we can't grow exponentially forever. And it's not even mentioned. It's not on the table. Is this deliberate or is it ignorance?
No, I actually think that we don't do this because we think of it as eco-fascism. So we don't look at population as the issue. We look at something like growth in terms of capitalism and economies is something that's completely unsustainable. So we do not go down that pathway. We don't think it's appropriate. When we're talking about population control, we're usually talking about this in coded terms about global South or communities of color, and we're not going to do that.
Scientifically,
I mean, in terms of, and again, just to pick up on that, I mean, again, there are times that we certainly write about, growing populations in for example, like, in India and elsewhere. But again, it's, as Tristan's saying, like, there's the question of consumption and kind of how people do it. And like, for example, if you look at the demand for air conditioning, that is something which also is expanding, not just because there are more people, but because it is getting hotter. And so that makes it more important. Like, look at what's happening, not just in a place like India, where that is really significant, and we're at a real pivot point of, are they using, can we truly phase out hydrofluorocarbons and, kind of climate super pollutants that are used in air conditioning, which is one track. But also in Europe, people are looking at installing air conditioning in a way that has a climate impact. So there are a number of different factors in this equation.
striking it was not mentioned.
We'll try to keep questions short so that everyone can get a question in. You had a question, yeah?
Hi, my name is Gunther Glenk. I'm a professor at the University of Mannheim, usually a research fellow right now at Harvard Business School. I'm interested in to what extent you work with scientists from different fields to create new stories. I mean, your example with the is a great example, but sometimes like just new studies that come out, do you cover these? And in an ideal world, how would you hope to engage with researchers? Because for researchers, it's also a great outlet, but we don't necessarily have the time to sort of open it up. But perhaps we can do a better job at communicating it and working with journalists.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to all of you, I guess. But
I actually love this question, if you don't mind. I love working with researchers, so our work on misplaced trust and previous stuff has been hybrid sort of investigations with academics. We really like doing this. It's a lot of hard work to try to make this happen, but I think that journalists and scientists and academics generally share a lot of the same goals. And especially when it comes to sort of thorough research, being able to sort of blend those together into stories, I think is some of the most exciting work that we can be doing. And I think that there should be a lot more of it at all of our outlets. So, what I would like to see in the future is some way in which we can get editors and reporters together with academics to start talking more about what work is going on, where we can come together in terms of doing that kind of investigative work. Because I think it works best with investigative. I don't know how y'all feel about this, but I think it's really, really exciting to sort of do more blended hybrid work like this. So I think it's definitely sort of a next frontier to really double down. Because I think all of us have done this at our organizations. All of our organizations have undertaken stories like this in the past, but like amping it up, I think is really the next frontier.
We do a ton of this as well, and I would say it also works for data analysis and visualizations, not just. The problem is really personal relationships is the only way that it happens. We absolutely cover studies, everyone does it, and that is another way that your work can resonate, but really what it takes is having enough of a rapport, reaching out to journalists, just look at the work and see what you find most intriguing and reach out to that journalist. All of us are very easy to email, and that's usually the way that conversation starts.
You had a question, and we'll move to the back of the room. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Rekha Murthy, and I actually am a podcast strategist. But my question is actually about the roles that I've had as a journalist, working with climate journalists, and also as a local climate activist. And first of all, I want to thank the Globe because this was around the time that I started getting really involved in local activism. So I'm sure there were folks before Darna and Sabrina, but their reporting provided incredible evidentiary heft to the policy activism and the information sharing that was just going on in my community in Arlington. And that and my experiences in podcasting where the numbers are really low. So we look to other ways to assess the impact. And so that's my question for all of you is, yes, there are numbers, as you were saying, Hannah, the numbers go up. But my curiosity is also around other ways of assessing the impact of your work because it's there, right? It's in how the activists can use it. It's how the policymakers can use it. But I'm curious how you're able to assess that and get a picture of those kinds of more qualitative but really important impacts. Thank you.
I'm going to answer this one because it can be a very satisfying part of the job to be able to see the work that we do here cited by people in this room, by policymakers, by leaders in lots of different areas. Just last week in the Senate Budget Committee floor, one of our stories about the intersection of climate change and homeowners insurance was cited. And one of the charts from that story was held up on the Senate floor.
Boring stuff shine.
It was
Indeed.
a really interesting story by Chris Flavelle, I believe.
It was, and Mira Jansakal, who did the data analysis on that piece. And it was Mira's chart that was held up on the floor. It was a bar chart. It was not something, that we spent days and days and days on, but it was a very powerful chart. And the message in that Senate budget meeting was this trend looks like the 2008 real estate collapse. Like, this is what the beginning of it looked like. And maybe this chart is going to help us to investigate more. And that kind of impact is really, really that's what gets me out of bed in the morning sometimes.
The lady in the white shirt.
My question has been asked.
Oh, okay, great. Then the lady in the white shirt.
I was sitting behind him. Hi, thank you for this is fantastic. Couple of quick questions. So when it comes to the machine and the news organizations need to be profitable and in order to keep funding this work, how much does the machine play a factor in terms of what's published or not published? And then how much does fear engage versus encouraging build upon progress type stories engage? What have you learned about how to get more engagement over time?
To the machine, I mean, I've been a journalist 24 years. I've never had a publisher tell me what I could or could not say, ever. I mean, I think.
Same.
Yeah.
Second question, fear versus.
Yeah,
in the story.
Because I think to the point on people kind of bury their head in the sand sometimes.
Yeah.
Obviously, everyone in this room will read, big bold stories, but at the end of the day, some people it might be too much for them to face. And so, how much do you lean into presenting all the information and potentially people getting overwhelmed versus people feeling like, wow, there is some progress here, and I can do something, or I can engage with this.
I mean, it's hard. We try and give people a little bit of hope when they read the stories. I mean, there's a cool new tool from this organization where they can map what your city or your block would look like in a flood. And we are being very careful about it because it is, we don't want to scare people. Like, we don't know this is going to happen, but this is what could happen. And so we're balancing. I mean, they're very powerful images. You can look and see, where you type in where you live, and if there's a storm of this magnitude, what would happen? And you think, oh my gosh, like, that's bad. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So we're still debating.
And we have a line of coverage called Climate Solutions, which is not just climate solutions, but environmental solutions. And we found that it really resonates and addresses some of the news fatigue issue, that people are interested in those stories. And again, they're not puff pieces, but they're real examinations.
The man behind you in black, yeah.
Thanks so much for the wonderful
It's a song, man.
I'm Charles. I have a question about local journalism. So a lot of the sausage gets made and will continue to be made, especially with the IRA rollout at the state and local level. So the sort of unsexy institutions, the city councils, the state public utility commissions, the state energy offices, where all of this work will ultimately live and be implemented. I'm just curious, especially for the national outlets, what you view as the role in covering and elucidating some of those kind of unsexy institutions where this work will live, and especially in light of the declining kind of resources and role that a lot of local outlets have these days, given their financial realities.
I think this is to your question as well, too. I mean, unpopular opinion here, we're, as national outlets, we hoover up. The news deserts are growing all of the time. We're putting some resources into more local reporting and such, but we do a lot of collaborations, and I think collaborative reporting with local news outlets is the way to go for better coverage in the future. But we're, the news deserts are growing every single day, right? We're losing reporters, we're losing outlets. There has to be a concerted effort from all of our national outlets as well, too, to do better support of those local news outlets also. Because you're absolutely right, it's happening at a local level. This is how we find a lot of our stories as well, too. And we start being able to connect the different dots to sort of see like, oh, this is happening here and here and here. Let's take a broader look at that. Like, we all rely on each other. All of our work is reliant on being able to be shared and read everywhere. And I think the more that we lean into making sure that we are working together and sharing our resources, our knowledge, our audiences. We can do that a lot more. But the big thing is really more resources going into local news outlets, I think.
A few things. So first of all, I've worked with VR HR projects, virtual reality. Wonder if any of you use that as a tool to engage new audiences in new ways. Do you ever cover cybersecurity and all of these issues? And then the third thing is, years ago, I worked on a public television national audience development project for unserved audiences. Amazing project to be a part of, a 3-year project called From Independent Television Service, if you've ever heard of it. And we were co-designing campaigns. We were called field organizers, and there were 10 of us across the country working to bridge the work of the filmmakers with real audiences and constituencies, meeting people where they are, co-designing with them how they could use the stories in ways that would serve their purposes. And I wonder if there are budgets to do this kind of thing. Even for college campuses, we worked with, specific departments that were designing, talking about various curriculum, and then a story would engage with that. So I'm just wondering about that. And then I would love to talk with you, because I'm in discussions about developing a game course for game designers around climate and innovation. So if any of you would be open to talking with me about that, I would be really thrilled to just have a conversation with you. So that's a lot. I'm sorry.
That's a lot. I can speak to one of your first questions, which is the VR aspect to this. We did a project a few years ago that looked at air pollution, cities' air pollution, and what we did was you could actually visualize in the room. You could see the little particles. We visualized them all, and you could hold up your phone and use the app to actually see what air pollution in your city's worst day compared to, say, Delhi or San Francisco during the wildfire season, things like that. So you could actually look at the different particulate matter. You could visualize the sort of thickness of the particles. That was pretty novel. It was really fun. It was a nice example. And we also worked with that team on one of Denise's favorite pieces, which we didn't have up here, but it was visualizing what an atmospheric river would actually look and feel like compared to an atmospheric river hitting California repeatedly. So what normal rain looks like versus extreme rain versus the scary kind of rain. And that we tucked into, let's see, California megastorm NYT. We'll get you there.
Yeah, because there's so much coverage that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We were talking earlier that the phrase atmospheric river is something that maybe a few years ago people weren't necessarily familiar with. And I feel like the work of the people at this table, atmospheric river is now a concept when we talk about extreme weather that makes sense to people. You can actually, because we've done a reasonably good job of actually visualizing it in projects. So this was a project we did a couple of years ago. To your question on scientific research, this is a study story. This is a single study that came out, and this is what we decided to do with that single study. So this is the kind of the piece that I was talking about. So you can see the difference between how much rain, 0.4 inches per hour versus 1.9. Yeah, so we've done some fun things. I know you asked a lot of other questions, but there's room in newsrooms to experiment. And Tristan, you spoke to that as well, and I think that's something that we all really find extraordinarily valuable, because that's how we move the field forward in directions that you're talking about.
Trying to get in 2 more questions. The person in the back, yes. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Natasha. I'm a recovering journalist. And so I wanted to ask you guys about sort of framing coverage, and specifically, when we talk about reflecting multiple sides of a story, very often we're talking about people's positions and views And I'm really, it's been my observation that when you're covering climate, very often what you have is a collision of interests as well. And I'm wondering if you're finding that the coverage reflecting that is adequate. And I mean, this can really cut across the board, right? Whether you're like, on indigenous lands where conservationists want to prevent drilling, but a lot of jobs actually rely on it. Or whether you're a lefty liberal and you're wanting to include, install solar panels, but you've done the math and it really doesn't add up. Or like insurers want to disincentivize construction in coastal areas, but that means a lot of people have to like sell their house and find a new one, and that's expensive and it's difficult. So there are all these collisions of often material interests, and because opinions are so polarized also on climate, I wonder if you feel like there's adequate coverage really reflecting like, this affects different people really differently, and there's not a uniform effect that we're looking at, and telling those stories. Do you feel like that's enough of a part of the narrative and the journalistically shaped discourse on climate?
Well, I'm curious how the recovery is coming along. So we did a story on the North Coast. I'm blanking on the name of the town. I'm embarrassed. The last town before New Hampshire. They put in a lot. Anyway, they put in several $100,000 worth of sand to buffer their homes there.
Newburyport.
No, it's not Newburyport.
Salisbury.
Thank you.
Yes.
I've only been here 18 years. So Salisbury, they put in several $100,000 worth of sand to reinforce the got washed away in 48 hours. Bad luck, bad timing. And so they got their heads together and like, what are we going to do to protect our homes? And the only solution they could come up with was let's try again. And so you have several perspectives. You have some people say like, this is madness. You're just throwing money away because eventually, the sea levels are rising, and you have to have managed retreat. And if your home is there and you've had that home for many generations, that's very hard to accept. So our reporter went up there, and some of the homeowners were saying, no, this is absolutely not an option. And so we have all these different perspectives. But if I build a wall to protect my home, that water is going to go to her home, right? Sorry. So there's not clear answers. So we tried to talk to everybody we could, and my takeaway from the story as a reader was, this is tough. This is going to be tough, but you got there's no single answer.
We'll take one more question, and I think we have a reception outside, or coffee here, something. But I think we'll stick around for a few more minutes. So yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bill Vambas. It seems that the world is collapsing. What I see right there, whatever you state. Great job, by the way. Is there any way that Donald Trump can change his mind? What if we compel him to change his mind and we can save the planet? Is there any way that, what do you think? Is there any way that he can just join the club and help with the climate? Perhaps maintaining the interests of the incumbent companies and just joining the climate companies?
I guess I would just say, based on the reporting that we have done, including multiple times reporting what he said in private fundraisers in recent weeks, I don't see any indication that Donald Trump is shifting how he views climate, or his recent comment on Fox and Friends earlier this month, where he said that sea level rise is a good thing because it's going to create more beachfront property. So there's no indication that will shift.
That said, we did a project last year, a 3-part series that was called "The Energy Transition is Happening Faster Than You Think." And it is in a lot of different sectors and a lot of different ways, the energy transition, and by that I mean fewer carbon emissions in many ways, is happening around us and in lots of different ways. And that momentum is not likely to be immediately reversed by any political changes.
Yeah, I think that's great. We can end it on a slightly hopeful note, which is unusual for a talk on climate change, I think. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. We really appreciate it. It was such a fascinating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed this, and please stick around for a few more minutes, and let's give the panelists a round of applause.